Welcome back to the Bite Pod, where we break down the realities of global trade compliance and the tools teams need to navigate an increasingly complex landscape. Today, we're turning our attention to U.S. export controls, a space that's moving faster than ever. Between rapid shifts in emerging technologies, evolving geopolitical relationships, and heightened scrutiny around research environments, compliance teams are being asked to stay ahead of changes that are both technical and strategic. To help us make sense of it all, I'm thrilled to be joined by Dr. Jennifer Sake, Managing Director of Treliance. She is someone who brings more than 25 years of experience at the intersection of export controls and scientific research. Jennifer, we're so excited to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Jennifer's experience spans export control, risk assessment, EAR and OFAC compliance, deemed exports, commodity and technology classifications, and developing business processes that actually work in practice, not just on paper. She's especially well known for her work in university and research institutions, helping them understand how export controls apply in both academic and non-academic settings, where the rules can feel anything but straightforward. So as we jump in, that was a lot. It sounds like, background is extensive. We like to just have our guests take us through kind of how you got into export controls, what drew you to this field, and how you ended up where you are today.
Sure, happy to talk through that. I started my career as a materials engineer when I conducted research in academia and in industry and did product development work in industry. And over time, I shifted into a business process improvement role. I wanted to learn about how the whole company operated. And that role happened to be about export controls. And I was up for it because I had previously worked in roles where I was the researcher and some peers had to leave the room because of deemed export issues and their license, the license wasn't issued yet. So I was familiar with the regulations at that level. I continued to go deeper into export controls, building out a larger team that was focused on supporting export classification and deemed exports and those kinds of related issues from within an engineering and technology function. And then I just kept going. So 12 years ago, I started Treliance with the mission of helping the broader research community understand and follow U.S. export controls.
That's awesome. Such a unique path to get there, too. So with your background, what keeps you excited and motivating you to work in export compliance after all these years?
The aspect that I love the most, and it's what really got me hooked at the beginning, and still I find the most interesting, is that these rules are really complicated, maybe overly complex. And I love taking something that is complicated for someone who is in the beginning of their career looking at this or in the early years and turning it into something that's digestible and actionable for universities and companies so they can really do something about it and be compliant.
Yeah, I feel like even in the intro, the words that are thrown out, even describing export compliance, there are such technical terms there. It's hard to understand it at a baseline, but then even stay on top of the changes that are occurring.
And the lingo in this field, more so than in other fields, I think.
I think so too. So if you're able to walk us through what are some ways organizations or, universities, research institutions, what are ways that organizations can get a handle on current or future changes to export controls?
Well, over the last decade, and really even more than that, the U.S. government has continued to put increased attention on export controls and place greater restrictions through the EAR, the ITAR, and OFAC sanctions. And a number of years ago, BIS, under the Commerce Department, they'd announced a list of emerging technologies that they said these are going to get increased attention. We care about these technologies, but they were stated at a really high level. And then what you saw the government do was follow what historically had been followed, which is the standard federal rulemaking process. So essentially, one would see a series of Federal Register notices where there'd be a notice of proposed rulemaking. You would have a public comment period, so organizations could share their thoughts. They would then become final rules, sometimes interim final rules. And then there would be chances for things to change, right? So there's a whole process to it. Companies and universities had really a heads up. Now, what we're seeing in this space, like in others, are executive orders that come out. And with that, you might see a published final rule at the same time that comes out the same day. And that might be the first communication you see, along with some more informal guidance memos that might be on an agency's website. The 2025 AI announcements, those are a great example of this new approach. Now, will this approach stick with us, over time with different administrations? That's yet to be seen. But at the moment, the changes can be quite dense. And so if that's the communication mode, what you see is that it takes a lot of time to dig into these changes and figure out, well, one, do they even matter or relate to what my company or university does? Because not all of them matter or at the same level. And so with this new approach, organizations don't have as much time to digest it because it just comes at you very quickly versus having had that longer lead time to anticipate it. Tralliance does create a breaking news alert through our research export controls training called React. These alerts are a helpful resource because we watch out for those updates and we keep a pulse on things that are coming or changing or being announced through various avenues. And then we boil it down to identify the ones that really matter to research and technology organizations. So we do that filter, and then we further break down, well, what actually happened and what do you need to do? So it's a time saver. Alternatively, you can sign up for the different alerts from BIS, DDTC, OFAC directly, and you can really customize what kind of alerts you get and dig through those.
Yeah, and those, just for our listeners, if you were only signed up to one of those, now the recommendation would be sign up to all of them, right? Like if you were only on BIS updates right now, everyone should have notifications turned on for the others as well. Would that be your typical recommendation there?
Yes, for sure. And each of those agencies, they don't even have just a single notification. It's not just one box you check and say, let me know BIS when you change something, right? It's each agency has multiple checkboxes for you to select, oh, I want communication from this exact topic, for example. So because they all have different teams working on things. And so the structure for even email notifications is really broken down.
Yeah, and I think this is so important because I think right now, in the trade world generally, there's so much coming at us right now about tariffs, right? It's tariffs and tariffs are changing and track your tariffs, but exporters are facing rapid changes as well. And it's a lot to keep track of for anyone, right?
Yes, for sure. I mean, tariffs are that's the piece of international trade that's hitting the daily news. In another month, other months, years, who knows what that's going to look like, right? So things change over time, and these core export rules are indeed getting more complicated, and there is more, I guess I could say, vagueness around what rules to follow, because with the change in administration these last couple of years, what we already saw with the AI space was a flip of some rules existed, and then the current administration said, well, you don't need to follow those rules. They won't be enforced, So the communication has been really tricky in that regard in terms of guidance from the government. And it's almost makes it even more pertinent to be paying attention to those because they're there, but kind of hidden.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess taking a step back, in order to know what you need to be tracking and know anything about, your role in exports, it really is going to come down to classification, right? And export classification is so hard, probably recognized as one of the toughest things in export compliance. Can you walk us through a little bit as to why it's so hard and tips that you can share when people are approaching export compliance?
Export classification, that piece is definitely one of the driving forces behind why the government agency may require you to have a license from them. It's not the only reason, but it's a key reason. And it is one of the most challenging things to have to analyze I think one reason is that the structure, let's just take the EAR for simplicity. The structure of the EAR's Commerce Control List, it's not obvious. You can read on the website, you can read in, learn in kind of high level training that there's categories, under that there are groups, there's reasons for control, right? You can see the snapshot of that high level structure and still be confused on how to actually classify something. There are relationships between export control classification numbers called ECCNs, and there's really specific definitions that are found in different parts of the Commerce Control List and different parts of the EAR. The relationships between these terms and between certain ECCNs is not obvious. So one tip is to learn the relationship between the ECCNs that matter for your research field or your industry. For instance, for every set of highly controlled ECCNs, there often is another parallel set of less controlled ECCNs, numbers that have fewer restrictions on it. And it's important to understand that full spectrum and know, well, where is your company or university sitting? Are they on the line? Are they about to trip into the more highly controlled set, even if at the moment they're in the less controlled set? There's also a relationship between ECCNs that cover tangible goods, physical goods, technology or technical data, and software, which includes source code, when you're talking about the same scientific space. So your organization may be handling just the tangible goods. Maybe they're working on just the hardware or the materials or the chemicals, for example. If you see an ECCN that covers that tangible good, it's wise to check for technology or software ECCNs that relate to that, that would fall under different ECCN numbers. So you're going to see it in a different part of the Commerce Control List, and it may not be obvious unless you really look and know where to look to make those connections. Because you might find your organization has more numbers, more controls that they need to pay attention to than they first thought.
Interesting. Yeah, and when you were talking about kind of like towing the line of the more classified versus less classified, or more controlled versus less controlled, excuse me. There are ways to design for that as well, right? Like if you can work with engineers or team members to say, you don't need this next thing that'll push us over. If you can do, achieve the same goal with the less controlled input, then perhaps, we stick with the less controlled input.
Right. And that's why it's so key for classification determination and the process behind classification determination to be embedded into your product development process at a company, or embedded into your proposal and award contracting process when it comes to a university, because you're hitting it at that earlier stage where the output isn't finalized yet, the deliverables aren't finalized yet. And so you, as the export compliance officer, can share insight as to factors to think about, right, that can make life harder or easier later, right? And if you really need a certain feature and really need to achieve a certain technical parameter, then you want to go into that knowing what the controls are going to be around that future thing. If you don't need that level, then to your point, well, then let's see how the team could pivot, because it will make the compliance needs, much, much easier in some cases.
Yeah. And then I know we've kind of been talking a little bit also around like research environments. What are unique challenges that a research environment specifically faces when it comes to export controls?
There are two key challenges that come to mind. One is that universities and research labs, they're often highly matrixed in terms of reporting structure. Each professor or principal investigator often operates like a small business owner, and they seek funding, they manage research staff. So the connection with the researchers, it's a very delicate yet important relationship that an export compliance officer has to build out and strengthen over time. And it's critical for that compliance officer to be viewed as a positive resource and to be a positive resource for the researchers, because that's what enables them to focus on the actual scientific research itself. A second challenge is that the nature of research is that folks are pushing the boundaries of what's done before. That's scientifically exciting, and at the same time is challenging for critical compliance elements like the export classification determination that we were just talking about. So being able to communicate well with the researchers on the actual scientific work and understand the technical statement of work for a project is key to being able to successfully take care of all the checkpoints when it comes to export controls, in particular the classification piece.
Interesting. Yeah. I guess that then kind of brings in the question, like who determines and what's the balance between export controls and innovation, right? Like how can we, in this, I'm just going back years now to one of our first podcasts is we had this discussion around like innovation versus export controls and what that looks like. Do you have any thoughts there on kind of how research environments can work within the controls, but also like promote their innovation?
Yeah, it's just really important to stay on top of the latest rules. You know, it's I guess it's simple to say that, complex to do, but that is the key. In the research world where we see export controls coming up, not purely standalone as export controls needs, but is through the vein of research security and research security guidelines and requirements that are still evolving and still being fleshed out. There's an element of export controls training, though, that is the linkage between these two worlds. There's also other related things like training on international travel, for example, right? That kind of bridge both worlds. But it's just research is exciting, it's necessary, and it's something that definitely governments around the world and the US government, recognize the value of it. However, that also means that there's at the same time increased sensitivity and awareness around when it can get into the wrong hands and what other folks can do with it. How can you build off of that, right? So there's increased regulation around research and its output in general, and I think that's just a reality that folks doing advanced research have to be aware of and know that as they push those innovative boundaries, there's always that other hand, right, of compliance that you have to think about.
Yeah, and you mentioned international travel, and earlier you mentioned, working and having other people have to leave the room. So just taking a step back, we call it export controls, but can you walk our listeners through who maybe don't have as much experience? Why would someone have to leave the room? You're not sending anything anywhere, right? So, why do people have to leave the room? Why is international travel an issue?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk through that. You are right that the word export really it can be misleading for folks. So the regulations are referred to as the export controls regulations, but really it's so much more than what a person normally thinks of as an export. So these regulations collectively cover the literal export out of the US. So if you ship something, that is an export. Whether that thing is a physical thing, data, software, you've sent it out of the country, right? So most people understand that to be, yes, that is the definition of export when I look it up. What it also covers, though, is the sharing of that data electronically, right? So if you add to a shared drive, right, and someone from another country accesses that data, right, in the simple hypothetical here, that is an export as well of that data. to that country that the other person is in. The other thing that is even less obvious to folks is what's called a deemed export. And so those are transfers of technology or software when it all happens within the US, but it's to a foreign person. And then it is deemed to be an export to that person's home country. So whatever they're a citizen of, that is a deemed export to that country. Even though none of us have left the US, we're all maybe sitting in the same room. Maybe we all work at the same company or university too, right? Even that that isn't a factor the way these regulations are written. So this deemed export situation is what was arising, in my past example of someone having to leave the room because that individual was a citizen of another country where the company needed a license for the technology I was presenting on that related to high temperature coatings. That individual, because of the citizenship, the company needed a license for that individual to see the information because it was deemed to be an export to that country. Even though we literally worked for the same company, worked on the same project team, both full-time employees, right? It's all comes back to that deemed export is another way that an export occurs, the way the regulations are written.
So just adding to the complexity.
Yes, for sure.
So if you had to boil it down, what's one thing an export compliance officer should strive to do to stay compliant with U.S. export controls?
It would be to systematize your screening and analysis. Establish set workflows. You might see that some of the workflows are more manual, where you use templates and spreadsheets, where others are more automated and you use a full IT system. Then you might have another group that are hybrid, where you take some standard templates but you're using them within an IT portal. You're going to see that whole blend because that's just the reality of tailoring how to screen and analyze for the various triggers that can come up when it comes to export controls. Having these different types of processes that utilize different tools is very common when you look at organizations that have a full export compliance management program. The key isn't in systematizing in a certain way. The key for sure is have a system, have a standard process on how you tackle all the different triggers that can come your way as an export compliance officer in terms of needing to do a deeper dive into the regulations.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's not about putting a process down that you copied from someone else. It's about actually having a process that is unique to the needs of your institution. Is that a good summary?
Yes, for sure.
And just going a little off script here, we've been seeing enforcement ramping up on, the export side for private companies. Are you seeing the same in research institutions or university settings?
For research organizations that are universities or nonprofit research centers, it's really been kind of a continuous flow. Mm-hmm. You could go back a couple decades and really see the timeline, and there's a steadiness to it. There's some themes in a focus on biologicals and export controlled biologicals that can be used, for bad reasons, right? And so the government cares about this dual use aspect, and it happens that they're about biologicals. I anticipate that will not necessarily be true moving forward when you look at the focus of the regulations. But there's really been a steady stream. When you map that out, you don't really see a long pause, and attention on universities. So we don't have to look too far back to see some university cases. We don't have to look too far back to see some cases that maybe aren't as public, and they're not universities, but they are nonprofit research organizations. And they deal with the full spectrum of issues. Shipping something out of the country without proper authorization. It could be the deemed export issue of foreign persons accessing export control technology within the US. And that deemed export issue is one that you see it in the university setting and in that nonprofit research center setting. And that's attention on that, I think, is going to continue.
Yeah. And so for listeners who want to level up their export control knowledge, what tools or resources or frameworks would you recommend?
Well, there are a lot of educational opportunities out there. For sure, the conferences at professional societies are great, right? And I think networking in your space is so important. Um, Finding the best educational resource for your specific situation, your organization, I think that's the key. Everyone's time is limited and you can only go to so many meetings and attend so many webinars, right? So if we focus on the EAR for a moment, to kind of dip your toe in the water to get some training, you can certainly watch the short videos that BIS offers on their website. The benefit is that they're free, they're easy to access. The con is that they may not go into the level of depth that you need or that your stakeholders need. Our Export Controls Essentials program is for the research community, that tailored set of tools, because it has EAR lessons, guides, templates, breaking news alerts that are all really honed in on what matters to research and technology organizations. So we're making some exciting improvements to that in the coming months to make it even more accessible to groups at a given organization. So folks can stay tuned for that.
Yeah. And I know BIS published their new interactive tool for the ECCN that made the country chart a little bit more searchable. So if you haven't been to those websites recently, check them out. Any other open source tools that you've seen, Jennifer, that you would recommend?
I would just reinforce what you said is the new BIS website. It's been really interesting to watch the rolling out of that website over time. At this stage, if you go to it today, I would say that they've really come a long, long way from when they first rolled it out. You see improvements in the interactive tools. I will kind of caution folks that the classification tool is still not going to tell you the classification of your item. Okay, but it is it's helpful in that how you can pull out different parts of the regulations. Honestly, even finding the regulations there sometimes is easier than looking at the electronic code of federal regulations.
Yeah.
I personally have a habit of going to the ECFR, but if you're newer to the regulations, you might find the way they break it down a little bit easier, more digestible. I do think that some of the tools they've come out in the past, maybe for some folks, aren't as helpful as the government maybe hoped they would be. The specially designed tool is an example. That's a really hard definition. I'm not sure the specially designed tool is helpful, but the classification tool I do think has helped to be an asset to at least help get folks thinking about, well, how do I understand this commerce control list better? So I would highly encourage spending some time on the BIS website. Their FAQs have increased a great deal on the new site versus the old, and they seem to have migrated and organized a lot of that content in a helpful way. So that's a positive as well. So I would definitely make a habit of, bookmarking that FAQs page.
What's one takeaway that you want compliance teams to walk away with after today's discussion?
I would say that the export controls regulations are only getting more complicated to understand and to comply with. So if your organization has any international flavor to it, that could be foreign engagements, foreign nationals working there, you ship to international customers, you buy from international suppliers. I realize that those are all triggers that many, many companies will say, well, yes, we do at least one of those things. Then you have to keep peeling back that onion of these export controls rules and make sure that you know precisely what your university or company has to do to stay compliant.
Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your insight. Export controls definitely can feel overwhelming, but you are able to break down that why and how, and it makes feel much more approachable. So hopefully our listeners feel the same way, whether you're on a compliance team or you're a researcher. For our listeners, we'll link resources in the notes. And if you'd like to get in touch with Jennifer, you can reach out via LinkedIn or treliance.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, share it with a colleague and subscribe for more conversations on shifting the landscape of trade and compliance. Thanks for tuning in to the Bite Pod. Until next time, stay compliant.